Hi, John.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty good.
Good. Good to see you.
Same here. And yeah, I can see you.
We actually can see each other.
It's a little alarming, actually.
We're not. I'm not. I don't think either of us feels entirely happy with the situation. We could look in the other. We could avert our eyes here. This. Oh yeah. This is much more comfortable. Um. So anyway, you've written this book. Now I'm holding the Bound Galleys. You have, I think, the real book, which looks more attractive than. Although this is kind of a nice minimalist design. But anyway, yours is the real and more eye-catching and fetching design. The End of War, and it's just coming out.
Right.
You've already been on MSNBC though. I see that you did not give Blogging Heads first dubs here.
Well, Bob, there's a little confusion over what Blogging Heads is now and whether it even exists. And so I was just sort of waiting to
I
have
see.
this
If you had
opportunity.
realized that we existed, you would have told them at MSNBC, sorry, take a number, get in line, Blogging Heads goes first.
If it had been 3 months ago, absolutely.
Absolutely. You would have told
By
Dylan
the way,
Radigan what he can do with his little booker.
is this Blogging Heads right now that we're doing?
Yes, yes, John.
Okay.
This is not CNN. Did you think this was CNN? I'm sorry.
No, I thought it was Atlantic.com or, you've got so many tentacles going out there.
Oh,
in the
well, there's no
pro-
telling where this could wind up being excerpted, if that's what you mean. I mean, you're right. I mean, I virtually control American media.
Okay,
Fortunately for your
anyway,
book.
whatever this is,
Wherever it shows
it's
up is
Bob's
good.
show,
We
and
know for
I have
sure
to be here.
it will be on Blogging Heads in its
Okay.
entirety on Blogging Heads.
Good.
So anyway, as I understand it, this is the book that is going to bring an end to war. That is your aspiration and your claim and virtually your guarantee. Is that right?
Yes, actually, I am hoping that there will be a movement to nominate me for the Nobel Peace Prize soon. I
Last
can
guy,
use the cash.
the last guy that happened to, as you point out, I think in your book, you pointed it out somewhere, was sending troops to Afghanistan just about the time he was receiving the prize. But
Yeah, actually, if I may, that's a good place to tell you why I wrote this book. So I have been, as you know, because we've talked about this a little before, I have been surveying people on their attitudes toward war for years now. My students, and whenever I give a talk, I have a captive audience. I ask people if they think war will ever end or if it's a permanent part of the human condition. And the vast majority of people, I think you may be an exception. I'm not even sure about you, but 90% of people think that war will never end, that war is inevitable. And even Barack Obama, while accepting the Nobel Peace Prize about 2 years ago, gave a speech in which he said that humans have been fighting wars for as long as there have been humans, and let's face it, we're not going to eradicate war in our lifetimes, which I thought was, even if he believes it, it's an incredibly pessimistic thing to say when you're accepting the Nobel Peace Prize.
and your whole slogan is "Yes, we can."
Pardon me?
And your whole slogan is "Yes, we can," right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's stick with a brand here.
Yeah. So I wanted to write a book to basically refute that kind of fatalism, particularly when it's tied to this idea that war is something that's deeply ingrained in our nature and goes way back into our evolutionary history, possibly all the way back to our common ancestor with chimpanzees. That's a scientific statement. I don't think that the science actually supports that. There are other reasons why people are fatalistic about war. They think that humans have a tendency to produce too many humans, so you get this overpopulation, and inevitably you get a violent competition for resources. That's another scientific statement about war that I also think is wrong. So I try to confront these pessimistic beliefs about war and portray war in a way that I hope will lead people to be more optimistic about the future, because I think that our beliefs influence what we do. They influence the kinds of leaders that that we choose and the sorts of foreign policies that we favor. And I think fatalism leads to policies and leaders that help perpetuate militarism and war. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important for me to try to get people to challenge their pessimistic beliefs.
Okay, well, so there's kind of an interesting tension between us, because on the one hand, I do agree that war can be ended. And in fact, I wrote a thing in the New York Times Magazine about 11 or 12 years ago predicting as much. It hasn't happened.
I remember.
It hasn't happened yet. But on the other hand, I think we disagree about the senses in which we are disposed to this kind of thing and how deeply rooted the problem may or may not be in our evolutionary history. So right. I kind of agree and disagree. But before we get to that, I guess I want to ask, is it really the problem that is belief in the inevitability of war really what helps start individual wars? You know, it's like right now with Iran, I don't hear anybody saying, hey, you know, we really can't help it. True, the war doesn't make sense. True, you know, the Iranian threat is being hyped. But we just get sucked into these things. Let's go. You know, you're not hearing that argument. You know, you're hearing people trying to convince other people that we really have to do this. You know. Well,
I think if you look at the U.S. military budget, it is justified, which is enormous. I mean, as you know, I'm sure our budget is about as big as the budgets of all other nations in the world combined. So how do we justify that? It's not in terms really just of this particular hotspot in the world right now or this particular threat, whether it's North Korea or Iran. It's justified in terms of all the threats that could arise in the future. And those sorts of concerns are justified, I think, and I've actually talked to people in the military about this, as well as scholars. It's justified by the idea that war is something that humans have always done. We've always fought, and we always will. The nature of the threat might change. So now we're worried about international terrorism, as opposed to 30 years ago when we were primarily worried about the Soviet Union. But there will always be these threats out there. There will always be bad, dangerous, violent people or groups, and therefore we must maintain this big, strong military to extinguish those as they arise, and even carry out preemptive strikes against our supposed enemies. And so that's where I think that the belief becomes self-fulfilling.
Okay. Now tell us what some of the ideas are, the specific ideas that are emanating from the scientific world, say, even bodies of research that you take issue with.
So, Bob, I know from your own writings that, correct me if I'm wrong, that you
You're wrong, but go ahead.
You would favor the idea that war is a behavior that goes way back in human prehistory. So that idea, probably the best known proponent of it right now is Richard Wrangham, a Harvard biologist or anthropologist who has studied chimpanzees and has compiled observations of chimps banding together in one troop and raiding chimpanzees in another troop and even killing them. And those observations are put together with the discovery that there are these pre-state tribal societies like the Yanomamo who engage in vicious fighting, one village attacking another, and that leading to this incessant feuding. And so the observations from anthropology have been put together with these observations of chimpanzees to create this picture of humans fighting as far back as you look in our prehistory, or as you can look at our prehistory. And what I've learned in reading the scientific literature is that war is actually quite recent, that good evidence of warfare only started emerging about 10,000 years ago in human prehistory. That's when you get clear-cut evidence of skeletons with projectile points, stone projectile points embedded in them, of weapons that are clearly designed not just for hunting, but for people, killing other people. You get fortifications and so forth. Okay. And so the scholars that I've been talking to say that the evidence strongly indicates that war arose quite recently.
Okay, so wait, you're saying before that, before 10,000, because the weapons they're using to kill other people were designed for hunting and not designed for war, then it's not war? I mean, it's not war if you just if a bunch of people take axes that were designed for chopping down trees or something and descend on their neighbors and kill them, that's not war because the tools weren't designed specifically for human...
oh, no, that would definitely be war.
Well, okay, so but before 10,000, don't you have evidence of people killing other people with man-made tools?
The oldest evidence of group violence. So we're not talking about individual aggression and homicide, one group of people attacking another group of people. The oldest evidence that anthropologists, archaeologists have found of group warfare is a burial site along the Nile that's 12 or 13,000 years old. It's a grave that has maybe 50 skeletons in it, and about half of those have stone points embedded in them. So it seems to have been some kind of massacre. Even that is an outlier. So you don't really get other evidence like that emerging until about, on a wide scale, emerging until about 10,000 years ago. And then you get it in Mesopotamia, you get it in Asia, you even get it in Australia, where people were living an extremely simple existence as nomadic hunter-gatherers. So you do get it spreading around the world at that point. But before 10,000 years ago, and definitely before 12,000 years ago, there was no evidence like that at all.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also the question of, well, it's two questions. One is whether, I mean, before that, there are no agricultural societies, right?
That's right.
Okay, so, you know, and so there's the question of whether it is possible almost to have war in the sense that we mean it, you know, really large-scale aggression. And in fact, when do kind of sedentary hunter-gatherer societies of any complexity show up? It's not long before then, right? I mean,
yeah, it would be around 10, 11,000 years ago.
Right.
So people settling down as hunter-gatherers, for example, in the southeast United States, and then gradually those people started cultivating crops and so forth. You know, one of the big disputes in anthropology has been whether hunter-gatherers as a whole fight or don't fight. And I think that's been settled, or did, in the distant past. And it's an important issue because we lived as hunter-gatherers for most of the Paleolithic era, from when the Homo genus first appeared about 2 million years ago until the Neolithic era, when we started cultivating crops and so forth. You know, there have been some anthropologists who said that the early hunter-gatherers never fought. That's just clearly wrong. We found evidence of warfare in Australia going back 10,000 years, the same in Asia and even in the Americas. So any society, even the most simple, can fight. But the crucial point I want to make is that there's no evidence of this sort of fighting before about 10,000 years ago. Now, another obvious objection to what I'm saying would be, and Wrangham and Steve Pinker and people like this who believe that war has deep roots, they often raise this objection, is that evidence or absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And so, you know, there's hardly any evidence of human habitation, human lifestyles before 10,000 years ago of any kind. And so that's why we don't have evidence of war. The problem is that we actually do have evidence of all sorts of complex human cultural behaviors going back well before 10,000 years ago. We have evidence of cooking emerging, of hunting, of art and music that go back tens of thousands of years ago. So if we have evidence of all these complex behaviors, why don't we have evidence of warfare? So that would be one answer to that. Another answer would be that when you get the beginning of agriculture, horticulture, whatever you want to call it, people start settling down and leaving a lot of evidence of how they lived. In some areas, there is clear-cut evidence of group violence, fortifications, as I said, skeletons that obviously indicate these people were killed violently. You get defensive weapons, shields, and so forth. So that's another indication that weapons aren't just being used for...
Right, but I mean, I guess I'd say we shouldn't dwell on this too long, that what you're saying is back when basically hunter-gatherers were not sedentary, they were kind of nomadic, they resettled, there's not clear evidence of war. And I guess the several things I'd say are, first of all, you're less likely to have kind of zero-sum games if you don't have territory to defend. So one of the things that's likely to start a war is less likely to happen. Doesn't mean the human proclivity to respond to zero-sum situations with organized aggression isn't there, A. B, the fact that they're not sedentary means that they can't be developing the kinds of artifacts that will be the clearest evidence of war. They got to travel light. I mean, you can't, they're not going to have be carrying around, armaments and stuff and weapons designed specifically for war, and so on. And then the third thing is there's a really rapid growth in population once you get sedentary populations, and so there's going to be more evidence of everything, as they said. And you're right. There of course is evidence of cooking and things before their sedentary life. On the other hand, cooking, even in the worst of cases, is a much more common phenomenon than war. Even in the societies that have war, when archaeologists come to America, they and excavate, they'll find a lot more evidence of stuff, of non-war stuff than war stuff. So, given all that, I really do think it is the case that, and then there's finally the question of what we even mean by war when you're talking about a very, very small group of nomadic people. What is the borderline between something like 4 or 5 guys beating up another 4 or 5 guys and maybe it getting lethal every once in a while? What is the dividing line between that and war? I think with a small nomadic society, it's almost not war the way we mean it. I wouldn't expect to find evidence of war in the modern sense.
Actually, Bob, but I just want to make it clear that the simplest societies, so Andamanese, these very primitive hunter-gatherers who live on islands, isolated islands in the Indian Ocean. Australian Aborigines, when they were first encountered by Europeans in the early 19th century, these are people who really had nothing to fight over, and yet they fought.
But that's an interesting fact, that all of the observed hunter-gatherer societies do in fact fight, right?
No.
They don't.
No, that's wrong.
What is the society that's been observed over a very long period of time and never exhibited organized aggression, even in the sense of 5 guys beating up 5 other guys and maybe trying to kill one of them?
Yeah, I think this sets up a false dichotomy. And the point I'm trying to make is that any society can fight. I think anthropologists have argued that war is kind of a disease of particularly complex societies, settled societies, hierarchical societies. That's wrong. Any society can fight. Let me just address a point that I think you were implying there, that war is something that people start to do when there are too many people, and especially when they settle down, they have something to fight over. They're committed to particular plots of land. They're starting to accumulate surplus food and other goods. So, then they have something to fight over. So that would be the resource scarcity argument. The problem with that is that you've got, for example, the Yanomamo. So the Yanomamo were this tribe that were first studied in the 1960s by Napoleon Chagnon, whom you and I both know. And here are these people who are living a lifestyle that is thought to have been pretty similar to how humans lived possibly tens of thousands of years ago, and yet they fight like crazy. So why? What Chagnon found was something that was the exact opposite of what you would expect if war emerges when there are too many people fighting over too few resources. According to Chagnon, there was an inverse correlation between population density and scarcity of game, for example, and violence. The areas of Yanomamo villages that were the most widely dispersed and where game was quite abundant tended to be the ones that were the most violent. What I take away from the anthropological literature is that war can arise for all sorts of reasons. It can arise because you have one hothead who's charismatic and convinces the village that they should go off and attack other villages. Or maybe they feel like they don't have enough women and they start to lust after the women of another village. Or it could be resource scarcity. It can be all sorts of reasons. But once war arises in a given region, it then spreads very rapidly. I mean, you compared war to cooking. What's particularly insidious about war is that if it arises, it's this cultural behavior that once it arises in one particular region, spreads even if nobody else wants it. Because if you've got a warlike neighbor, if you're a peaceful little Yanomamo village, and then your neighbor starts threatening you, what can you do? You can either surrender or run away, or you become warlike in self-defense. So the way I look at war is as this kind of extremely infectious meme that emerged for many reasons and many different societies around the world, roughly 10,000 years ago, actually different times in different regions, and then spread and became very persistent because of this peculiar dynamic within it that makes it spread even when people don't want it. And that's why it's been so persistent right up to the modern era.
Well, let me just be clear in my own view. I'm not saying that only when there's territory to fight over or something you have wars. I do think that you are more likely to have wars when there are zero-sum games in general. And you mentioned that I think in Chagnon's view, sometimes what these guys are fighting over is women. Well, to an evolutionary biologist, that is a scarce resource. That creates a zero-sum dynamic between the males who want the women. And I think in general, war tends to arise when there is at least the perception of a zero-sum dynamic, which isn't always true. That's why people who want to start wars want to convince you that those other people are a threat. They want to take your women. That's in fact a very common motif among people trying to start wars. Or they don't, they want to destroy your way of life. Blah blah blah. So I think it is the perception of a zero-sum dynamic that psychologically triggers the things that bring wars on. And I think, by the way, that sort of regularity is among the evidence that the human mind is designed by natural selection to mobilize kind of the psychological resources that sustain war under certain kinds of circumstances. I mean, I don't think war per se was designed by natural selection in the sense that when evolution, not much evolution has happened in the last, say the invention of agriculture. So when evolution was happening, the structure of society almost didn't permit what we mean by war today, right? But what is organized aggression in some sense, coalitions of males fighting other coalitions of males, are there, and sometimes females, less often, but sometimes, were the psychological mechanisms that sustain that favored by natural selection precisely to confront situations that are deemed zero-sum, I think the answer to that is yes. And I'm not sure if that's even incompatible with what you're saying. I don't know.
Okay, here's where I think we would disagree. That, obviously humans are aggressive. They are competitive, ambitious, and so forth. But war is this very peculiar manifestation of that obviously has a huge potential or real downside. So what I think happened in the case of war is that, as I said, it emerges for various reasons. And then because it is such a destructive behavior that for most men for most participants is extremely traumatic, the culture convinces people that it's this really wonderful thing to do. It becomes identified with manliness on the part of men. Warriors are elevated to very high positions in societies. You have special training to brainwash men into being hostile toward people and risking their own lives to kill others. So once war arises, it leads to these cultural transformations that have a psychological dimension to them. So I think that the psychology that makes war possible arises not because we have this kind of genetic module that goes back hundreds of thousands or millions of years, but that is brought out in us by our culture and by propaganda and the media and the modern world. And that's why it's because I think of war as something that basically culture has inflicted on us that I think also that I'm hopeful that it can be transcended. What culture gives us, culture can help us transcend.
Well, what I would say is that it's clear that whatever, the extent is to which we're psychologically predisposed to these things, culture can stifle any such tendency. I mean, it's obvious. You can point to countries that go generations without war. Well, if you can go 3 generations without war, I'm sure you can go 4. And if you can go 4, you can go 5. So, in that sense, in the way I think about it, I'm not sure how much I have to settle the argument we've been having in order to become more optimistic. But in any event, I mean, let's talk about the recent history of war. And, your book comes out not long after Steve Pinker's book. And he argues, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this, that, we are seeing positive trends, the amount of violence, including, violence in war, especially if you view it as a percentage of the population at the time, is tending to decline. I mean, certainly it's, we've gone since the last war between the great powers. It's now been almost 70 years. And whereas the distance between World War I and World War II was like a couple of decades, wars between great powers used to happen all the time. So there are these reasons to think that maybe something good is kind of happening. And I'm curious as to whether you think it is and how that fits into the argument in your book.
Absolutely. In my book, I also talk about the recent decline in violence, which I think is really encouraging. I've got 2 main disagreements with Pinker. First of all, he does buy this idea that war it's primordial. It goes all the way back, possibly to the common ancestor with chimpanzees, which I just think is wrong. And also, I think as a result of that belief of his, he creates this kind of simple model where war is this innate behavior that we have that we are overcoming as we become more civilized. So civilization is kind of the cure for war, according to Pinker. Now, that's an oversimplification to some extent of what he's saying, but I think that's basically his thesis. So the problem with the civilization part is that, we just went through a century where the greatest nations on earth, the epitome of civilized states, Germany and Japan, and then all the other European states, fought these incredibly bloody wars. Now, Pinker tries to argue that Nazi Germany, for example, was just a case of really bad luck, the sort of confluence of all these factors that led to this kind of random outburst of violence. I think that's a very, Steve is such a smart guy. I thought that was one of the weakest parts of his book. I think you have to recognize that nation states are in some ways, or have been through history, defined by militarism and defined by their vying with each other for power violently. And so the state isn't just the solution to war. The state is also part of the problem that has helped to perpetuate war. So I think it's important to recognize that when we're trying to figure out how to get past war. So, for example, right now, I think that the biggest, so in my book, I talk a lot about how war is really paradoxical, and a lot of the factors that cause war also are potentially solutions. The nation state would be one example of that. I think right now, one specific nation state, the United States, is both the biggest problem in the world and also the biggest solution when it comes to war. We have this gigantic national security apparatus that has really gotten so swollen. We are pursuing our interests violently throughout the world. We're carrying out drone assassinations and special forces operations in nations with which we are not even at war. We're really answerable to no law beyond whatever we decide we want to do. And there's this enormous gap between our rhetoric. We constantly insist that we're people of peace and justice, and yet our actions belie that constantly. So I think we're really, especially given that war has declined, casualties have gone way down, other nations just don't seem to be all that interested, most of them, in building up an enormous military. So I think the United States is perfectly poised right now to lead the world through example past this era of militarism by drastically cutting our military, by getting rid of our nuclear weapons once and for all in negotiation with other nuclear powers, and by also coming up with, some kind of international system. I think the UN would be the obvious body to do this, that would help all nations resolve their disputes, not only without war, but without even the threat of war.
And so far, do the Republican presidential debates make you optimistic about this?
Well, so people ask me a lot about Ron Paul, and a lot of my students are Ron Paul nuts. And there's some things about Ron Paul that appeal to me. So he's calling for pulling all our troops back from overseas, which I actually like, and deep cuts in the defense budget, which I also like. What I don't like is that he also wants to pull out of the UN. Right. So he's really sort of a classic isolationist. I think that the UN has proven that it can be extremely effective with its peacekeeping operations and international diplomacy and so forth at helping us resolve disputes peacefully. So that's my big disagreement with him. And I still am a believer in Barack Obama, even though he's been so much more hawkish than I'd hoped he would be. I'm hoping that maybe somebody gives him my book and leads him to recognize how wrong-headed his remarks during the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony were, and gives him a vision of a world without war, and he can take credit for it. But he's got to spell out the possibility of all of humanity with the leadership of the United States achieving world peace.
Well, I'm afraid that the most recent thing he read that apparently captured his imagination was, this was just a few days ago, and he's apparently gone on and on about it, was this piece by Bob Kagan about how America's greatest days are not behind it. And of course, Bob Kagan is. Should I let Fraser in? He's like scratching at the door. We haven't had our morning greeting ritual yet. I'm sorry, but I'm sorry.
Want to see John? Come here. Come here. Hey, doggy.
Every morning.
Oh.
Hey, buddy. How you doing? Say hi to John.
Look at that cute little gentle creature. Would never even consider killing anybody else.
Yeah, beautiful doggy. Beautiful doggy.
Sorry, but Frasier was once such an important part of Blogging Heads TV. I wanted to do that. I'm sorry, but I interrupted you. You were talking about
Barack Obama.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I was saying, well, anyway, we don't need to get into that. But he doesn't seem, actually, pardon me one more time, I'm going to close the door. He doesn't seem disposed to that kind of thing right now. Hang on.
You know, liberals always pin their fantasies where, we're disappointed by the first term of presidents in whom we invest all our hopes, like Bill Clinton, and we always think if they get reelected, then their second term, their true liberal nature and dovishness will come shining through. And, Bill Clinton didn't really do that for us. So now I'm sure a lot of liberals are hoping that Barack Obama will become a real bleeding heart liberal and dub in his second term. I don't know if it's going to happen. I don't know if it can. I think he's got to protect himself on the right. But it's interesting to me that John Kennedy, if you go back to some of his speeches, he gave this great speech in 1963, just months before he was assassinated, where he specifically addressed this very issue that I try to address in my book, the defeatism, he called it, the belief that humanity has always fought and always will fight. And Kennedy said that war is something that we do to ourselves. It is not something that is imposed on us by forces beyond our control. We do it. We choose war and militarism, and what mankind creates, mankind can undo. So we can get to an era of world peace. Kennedy was saying this, in 50 years ago. So there's a precedent for this kind of presidential rhetoric. It can be done without making you look like a naive, romantic, peacenik, hippie fool.
Well, the trouble is with people, what happened to Barack Obama does sometimes happen to Democratic presidents in particular. They are made to start feeling defensive about their national security credentials.
Right.
And, and the rest is history. I like to think that a different version of Ron Paul could generate something interesting in American politics. A guy who wasn't so weird, didn't have the weird history with the newsletters, and didn't have the weird obsession with the gold standard and blah, blah, blah. It's interesting, could somebody like that, the trouble is I don't think they could quite pull off a majority in either party, but they might be able to do some kind of third party run that would at least exert an influence on the dialogue.
Let me just, so if I want to be my sort of pie in the sky vision of how this could work politically is that you could get a real peace candidate who could create a coalition of, classic sort of secular peaceniks like me and you, but also appeal to fiscal conservatives. So that's what, Ron Paul has some of those people in his camp who just think that militarism is too expensive. It's insanely expensive.
Right.
It's it's the obvious area for us to cut the overall federal budget. Also, you could pull into this coalition religious people.
Right.
I mean, for Christ's sake,
in theory,
religious texts tell us.
Well, yeah, but this is a problem with this is another part of your book that you only touch on glancingly, but you have this view that religion in per se is this source of conflict, and so now you're saying, wait a second, if we direct our attention to the other parts of the text, we'll be fine. I think this is the problem with viewing religion as a prime mover in violence to begin with, actually. I mean, it does, these evangelicals, the things that keep them from focusing on the more, pacifist parts of the Bible are concrete things in their actual life that, or perceptions deriving from something other than their religious life that are what you need to change, I think.
Actually, in my book, I really don't do any religion bashing. I point out that
there is a phrase that of war motivated, quote, by religion or something.
Okay,
but anyway.
so I mentioned before that I point out that one of the paradoxes of war is that things that exacerbate or lead to conflict can also inhibit conflict. Religion is a classic example of that. So obviously, today in the world and all the way back into history, religion has led to intolerance and hatred and hostility.
Sometimes it has, and sometimes it's led to the opposite. In that sense, it's remarkably like non-religion.
Well, exactly. So the other side of religion is you've got people like Martin Luther King and the Quakers and Gandhi, who people who are inspired by religion to try to lead their societies away from conflict. So, what I'm saying, I actually have a passage toward the end of my book where I say that secular pacifists, peaceniks, should reach out to religious communities and try to show that they should have this common goal of trying to find ways of resolving disputes nonviolently. There's an analogy to what Edward Wilson has done in the realm of conservation. Wilson, the great biologist at Harvard, he wrote a book a few years ago called The Creation, which was a letter to an evangelical pastor. And instead of bashing religious people like that, Wilson reaches out to them and says, we have so much that we don't agree on, but there's a really important thing that we do agree on. We both cherish nature. You see it as God's creation. I see it as something that was created by natural selection. But we both agree that it should be preserved. And so let's unite toward that common goal. I think the same thing can be done in the realm of peace, especially if scientists and secular intellectuals get away from the kind of religion bashing that you have with Richard Dawkins.
I agree with you there that one of the prime movers of, if you ask why are so many evangelicals amenable to a call to antagonism toward, if not Islam, getting a little echo there. If not Islam per se, then too much about Islam. I think the answer is they feel threatened, and it does not help. And if you ask why they're fundamentalists in any faith, who are prone to defensive belligerence, the answer is I think there's a sense of threat of one kind or another. Often it's a sense of that they're threatened partly by modernity itself and secular culture itself, and it does not help for people like Richard Dawkins to go around making them feel more threatened. Obviously, you want to stand up for, public education, teaching the truth about natural selection and everything, but this gratuitously, well, why go on? We seem to agree on this.
I just want to say I agree with you on that, right. And I think one of the ways that reconciliation can be brought about is finding common goals.
Absolutely. And, well, you talk in your book about the famous Robert Cave experiment.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so this was an experiment carried out by a psychologist named Sharif. It was part of this sort of classic era of social psychology experiments that showed how incredibly malleable people can be.
And that were done, by the way, before the modern ethical restrictions on experimentation precluded these really kind of interesting experiments. But go ahead.
So Sharif was, he's sort of part of a class of scholars like Stanley Milgram, who showed how susceptible people are to the influence of authority. So in this case, he took a bunch of boys from Oklahoma, and they went to this camp, and he divided them into two groups. I think the Rattlers and the Eagles, and then put them in separate bunkhouses, and pretty much spontaneously, and he kept them separate in the beginning, so they could only see each other from afar, and they had contests between each other. And Sharif created this situation where very shortly these boys were raiding each other in the middle of the night, and beating each other up, and calling each other all sorts of vicious names. So you had this really incredible.
And he did this by creating zero-sum situations between them intentionally. So like they I think, as I recall, they would like invite them both to something where there was going to be food, and one would get there a little earlier and eat all the food, and the other group would get there, and the other guys had eaten all the food. So they systematically created zero-sum dynamics.
Right. And so it didn't take long before, it was like Lord of the Flies. Then what he did was he created situations where they needed to cooperate with each other for various reasons. So, for example, they were on buses taking a field trip, and then one of the buses broke down. I mean, the whole thing was set up, of course, and the boys had to cooperate to actually, I think the bus got stuck in mud, and the boys had to cooperate to push the bus out. In another case, the Sharifs told the boys that they could have some really cool movie, but only if they all put up a little money so that it could be rented. All the boys came together to do that, and before long, all these kids who had been enemies became fast friends, and they were all joking about these previous fights that they'd been having. So he just showed how easy it is to manipulate people for ill or good. Now, obviously, that's a two-edged sword.
Well, yeah, but let's be clear. What was the way to manipulate them for good is to put them in a non-zero-sum situation. Those were the situations that were conducive to peace. If there was so for example, I think they created a breakdown in the pipe that brought water to the thing. Well, that was a problem they all faced, and they faced in common and could best confront by working together.
I think, Bob, I hate to say this. In some ways, you're more optimistic than me. I think in that you believe humans are rational actors more than I do.
No, not quite, but go ahead.
Well, so the lesson I take away from the Sharif experiments and also, and even more from the Milgram experiments, is that humans have this deference to authority and this compulsion to sort of go along to get along, to conform to whatever the social norms are, that they end up doing some things that to an outsider would look totally irrational and cruel. So the Milgram experiments, just to remind everybody, this is where people thought that they were carrying out a kind of learning test. There's one person who is being told by the experiment to punish another person who is trying to remember words from a list or so forth. Mm-hmm. And the real subject of the experiment is told by the scientist to give an electric shock if somebody can't remember a word properly. Of course, the shock wasn't real, but the subject of the experiment doesn't know that and sees this person who isn't remembering given even life-threatening shock. So it's an actor who's actually pretending to be shocked. And the experiment showed, of course, that vast majority of people, more than 2/3 in test after test of this experiment, willingly cranked up the electricity all the way to what they thought were life-threatening levels to punish this person just for not remembering a word on a list. So this was cruelty and aggression, not carried out because people are actually innately cruel, but because they were just doing what they were.
Okay, but then aren't you suggesting that a firm part of nature is subservience to perceived authority? I mean,
yes.
Well, okay, then you're talking about an ingredient of human nature that's conducive to war that may be a legacy of natural selection, right? And
if you want to say that so I think it's fair to say that wars happen because we're sheep rather than because we're wolves, because we're herd animals who sort of do what we're told to do. I think so. There's a big downside to that, and that's how you get Nazi.
Or maybe they just keep putting the wolves in charge of the sheep, which I guess is what happens in the natural course of things. But anyway,
I think what this means, it just shows the importance of education and kind of moral enlightenment and so forth, where you have to show people that there are certain kinds of behavior that are just flat out wrong. And so when they will resist authority figures who are trying to convince them to act cruelly toward others, whether they're in their society or in a nation across on the other side of the planet. I think there's those classic social psychology experiments are actually quite disturbing, much more disturbing than experiments that supposedly demonstrate that males are innately violent.
But I would just be clear on that Robert Cave experiment. It is the fact that zero-sum situations were conducive to violence, non-zero-sum to reconciliation. That experiment is not just about authority. In fact, the authorities didn't sit around telling them to do anything. All the authorities did was create zero-sum situations and non-zero-sum situations.
Right.
And my belief is that on balance, and this is one of the possible dynamics Pinker entertains in his book, on balance, there are more non-zero-sum dynamics between nations relative to zero-sum than there used to be. And I think that's why we actually have seen a decline in war among great powers over the last 60 years. That's not the only kind of violence there is, unfortunately, but
well, another reason would be that I like to talk about war as something that we choose to do rather than something that is done to us by forces beyond our control. One objection to that could be that, well, throughout most of history, there are certain very powerful people who choose war, and then all the citizens have to get dragged into that. But what's happened over the past century, as you know, is that the world has become much more democratic. Mm-hmm. So, 100 years ago, maybe 10%. I mean, you can define democracy in different ways, but according to some kind of common definitions of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom to vote, sort of basic recognition of human rights, about 10% of humanity lived under democratic rule, lived a kind of free or quasi-free existence 100 years ago. Now it's about 2/3 of the population. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of nations are either democratic or at least quasi-democratic. You still have nations like China and even Russia that have little to no democracy, but there's this huge trend in a positive direction. And I think it's, you can't say necessarily that correlation is causation, but I don't think it's an accident that you've had this decline in violence at the same time that you've had this huge surge in democracy. So people are more empowered today, and I think they're recognizing the irrationality, if you like, of trying to reconcile their conflicting goals with violence, whether that's gang violence or international war.
Okay. Well, I hope you're right. I think one downside of the new recording system is it actually doesn't tell you how long you've been recording. But if I remember correctly, we're not that far probably from the 1 hour mark, so we should probably wind it down. But I want to say that two things. I want to say. First of all, this is a nice, refreshingly short book. In fact, I'll tell you, I was feeling guilty last night because this has been such a horrible week that I hadn't had time to read it. And then at 4 a.m., I woke up and couldn't sleep. So I got up and spent, a couple hours with it. And I wouldn't say I quite read every word, but I think I can, I can kind of say I've read the book now. So this is the perfect book for the modern era. When you don't have that much time, but you'd like to say every once in a while, "Hey, I read a damn book. I really did." And it reads beautifully, as your writing tends to do. And thinking about this, I think I still think that what I said earlier is true. That it isn't the case that right now, if we get dragged into war with Iran, it'll be because people thought war is inevitable. So what the hell? It'll be because they actually were made to believe, yeah, we have to do this. And so it's not like I think if everyone hurries and reads this book, we won't have war with Iran. On the other hand, I do think there's a particular kind of value to a book like this, which is that it can motivate activists. It can motivate people who want to, who become, kind of the driving force, and not just activists per se, not just people who actually go out and start a movement, but including those, and including other, active people whose opinions matter, who are opinion leaders and so on. So I think you should start a movement. I think you should become, possibly a guru.
We can start it right here.
Why don't you start a cult, and I will be your first member? I know you approve of cults.
Well, my hope was originally to start a religious cult, but that didn't really work out for me. So, a peace movement would be great. First of all, thanks a lot. I'll just end with this, to say that, I really wouldn't expect anybody to agree with everything I say in this book. My goal, and I say this in the introduction, is to at least get people to challenge their own thinking about war and militarism, especially if they are very pessimistic about the future. And then to, because every sane person wants war to end. Every sane person wants world peace. So the question is how we get there. And I'm hoping that my book at least get people thinking about this and having conversations with each other. If they don't agree with some of the ideas that I put forward about how we can get to a world without war, well, come up with your own ideas and let's talk about those. Because, we need to be creative and come up with every possible idea and then try them out to make this happen. But I think it's really important to believe that it can happen as a first step. And that's what I'm trying to convince people of.
You're good. I'd never imagined you being good in the evangelist mode, but yours is good.
I like it. It feels good. I've been a pessimist as a writer most of my life. I read about things we can't do and science and technology and so forth. So now I've got this new can-do persona, and it feels really good, Bob.
I like you better than I used to like you. We could argue about how high I'm setting the bar there, but anyway. Okay, so anyway, congratulations on the book. Why don't you hold your version up to the camera one more time?
Yeah.
And good luck with it, and sign me up for your cult.
Okay, Bob, and remind me how to shut my... Oh, I just hit the little...
We can just say goodbye and work on that later.
Okay.
Goodbye.
All right, bye, Bob.